Well, welcome to The Debate. Today we are examining the societal structures and, well, the governance of magic. Specifically, we'll be contrasting London's highly regulated, practitioner-controlled society with the quarantined, wild magic environment of Norwich.
Right. And we are exploring a central, deeply polarizing question here. Does the institutionalized, secretive control of magic by London's practitioners represent a necessary safeguard for human survival? Or is it a fundamentally corrupt system that is ultimately more dangerous than the chaotic, resilient autonomy of Norwich?
Exactly. And this discussion emerges directly from the aftermath of the Oxford cartography disaster. I will argue that London's strict containment and hierarchical control are pragmatic necessities to prevent global annihilation.
And I will argue that Norwich's transparent, community-driven autonomy proves London's system is merely a corrupt mechanism for hoarding power. I mean, it's really an unethical abdication of responsibility.
To really ground this discussion, we have to look at the undeniable reality of the Oxford cartography accident. Let's talk about what actually happens when a magical experiment interacts with the foundational fabric of reality. The practitioners were experimenting, it went catastrophically wrong, and they ended up fusing historical Tudor maps with modern-day geography. It unleashed shifting timelines, violently fluctuating populations, and, lethal phenomena like the Summer of Frogs.
Right. And for those who might need a quick refresher on the mechanics of a map fusion, we aren't just talking about a mild temporal glitch. We are talking about a 1990s concrete car park suddenly and violently sharing the exact same physical space as a 15th century plague ward.
Exactly. It was an apocalypse localized in Norfolk. Given the sheer scale of that cataclysm, London's practitioner-led regulation isn't just a policy choice. It is a necessary triage. The 10-mile exclusion zone, the massive metal wall, the strict tiered oversight of engineered magic, these are essential protocols. They exist as a firewall to protect the broader world from volatile, wild magic. And to maintain that barrier, the authorities must occasionally make ruthless, unpopular decisions. The survival of the modern world literally depends on it.
I come at it from a different way entirely. London's system isn't a pragmatic safeguard. It is an abdication of responsibility built on staggering hubris. The practitioners caused this unmitigated disaster, and when the dust settled, they simply abandoned the citizens of Norwich. They left children, like a 7-year-old Detective Barnaby, to fend for themselves on deadly streets. Furthermore, London's system routinely uses the excuse of maintaining public calm to justify framing innocence and covering up crimes. Norwich, by contrast, has forged a highly functional, transparent society that manages to thrive without relying on the very engineered magic that caused the disaster in the first place.
Well, let's start with the quarantine itself, because that is the physical manifestation of London's policy. I completely see why you look at Norwich and think, locking them away sounds cruel. But let's zoom out and look at the shared devastation. When those maps fused, the consequences were mathematically catastrophic. Modern suburbs vanished instantly because they lacked...
They were just overwritten by the past.
Yes, exactly. They lacked historical anchoring. And look at the human toll. The population of Norwich violently fluctuated from 140,000 up to millions as timelines converged, and then plummeted to 36,000. People were crushed by collapsing buildings, washed away into different centuries, or killed by historical plagues like cholera, polio, and the Black Death appearing overnight. Faced with an expanding radius of warped reality, the UN and the practitioners had absolutely no choice. They had to build that 14-foot metal and Flint wall. They had to retreat to save the rest of the country. Quarantine is brutal, yes. But imagine if tomorrow half of Manhattan was replaced by a medieval war zone that was actively spreading outward. You'd build a wall too. It is the definition of a pragmatic necessity.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it was purely a pragmatic necessity. The reality paints a picture of systemic cowardice. Yes, a wall might have been needed to stop the spread, but look at how they did it. The practitioners created the disaster, fusing Tudor maps with Castle Mall developments. And when the consequences of their own arrogance materialized, they threw up an exclusion zone, dropped some basic medicine, burned the bodies, and simply buggered off. They abandoned the victims of their own hubris.
They established a perimeter to stabilize the timeline.
Wait, let me stop you right there. Are you really saying that the containment was just stabilizing the timeline? They locked children inside. Look at Barnaby's background. She was a child fending for herself on the streets, becoming part of the city fleas, sleeping rough in a landscape that was actively trying to kill her. Meanwhile, the outside world viewed Norvikers with extreme prejudice and fear. Outsiders treated them as scum who carried death and disease in their pockets. A containment policy loses all moral authority when the architects of the disaster lock the victims inside the blast zone and completely wash their hands of them.
It is a tragedy, without question. But human beings, including experts, are fallible. The practitioners made a catastrophic error, yes, but the containment of that error is what allowed London and the rest of the globe to continue functioning. The outside world's prejudice against Norvakers, while deeply unfortunate, stems from a completely rational fear of the wild magic that literally tears reality apart. If the quarantine fails, the Oxford cataclysm goes global. You cannot prioritize the comfort of the 36,000 survivors over the existence of billions of people.
But the comfort of the survivors isn't what's at stake here. It's their basic humanity, which London's system actively suppresses to maintain its own power. And that brings us perfectly to the internal mechanisms of how these two walled-off worlds actually govern themselves. Specifically, let's look at their justice systems. London operates behind this grand illusion of civilized justice, but it is fundamentally built on institutional secrecy.
I see where you're coming from with the secrecy aspect, but I would argue that London's structured legal system provides procedural guardrails. Those guardrails are the hallmark of a civilized society. Take the case of Timothy Crow. He's a bus driver who claims he used magic to blow up a traffic light. The London police calmly process his case. They look into his history, discover he was rejected from practitioner school decades ago, and handle his delusions through proper bureaucratic channels. Now contrast that orderly processing with Norwich's brutal frontier justice.
You mean Sheriff Hitchman?
Yes, Hitchman. Look at what happens when Samuel King is found guilty of his horrific crimes, ravishing his own daughter and abusing women in the city. He isn't processed through a rehabilitation system. He isn't given a trial with appellate courts. He is summarily banished into the deadly Winsome River. Blind Bill and another officer simply shove him off the wooden boards to drown or go mad in the wild magic beyond the walls. It's barbaric. A civilized society requires the procedural guardrails that London provides, even if those procedures are heavily bureaucratic and occasionally opaque.
Procedural guardrails. Let's look at what those guardrails actually protect in London. They protect the powerful. You mentioned London's justice, but look at the reality of the William Cade case. Thaumaturge Persephone and the chief commissioner actively frame Cade for the murders of 2 practitioners.
A tragic misuse of authority by an individual, certainly.
It wasn't just an individual mistake. It was the system working exactly as designed. When Detective Barnaby, who was an eyewitness, reports that the practitioners were the aggressors and Cade was defending himself, Persephone simply dismisses her account, claiming Barnaby was confused. They attempt to silence witnesses, erase police records, and manipulate the narrative solely for the sake of public calm. London's system will literally overwrite the truth to protect its institutions. In London, they use personality muting on criminals,
which is a highly controlled magical procedure.
It's a chemical and magical lobotomy. They are effectively destroying a human mind to maintain order. Barnaby herself notes it is a chilling circumvention of true justice. They prioritize the illusion of order over actual justice.
I acknowledge that the upper echelons of the practitioner hierarchy, like Persephone, abuse their power. But you have to understand the sociological concept of why that illusion of order exists. The framework itself is designed to prevent mass panic. When you are dealing with individuals, thaumaturges who can level city blocks with a thought, maintaining public calm isn't just PR. It is a matter of national security. Panic combined with magic is a weapon of mass destruction.
But look at what Norwich achieves without those manipulative secrets. Yes, Sheriff Hitchman's justice is incredibly harsh. The river banishment is brutal, but it is honest. It is completely transparent to the community. And the results speak for themselves. Norwich has an incredibly low crime rate. Willoughby's records actually show us there are no drugs, no guns, and only 5 rapes on record. The women in the city are safe.
Because they are terrified of being shoved into a magical river.
Institutional cover-ups to calm the masses. She quells the riot through truth. She stands before the angry crowd, explains exactly how smuggled, engineered magic addled Jean Martinet's brain, and she builds community trust. Norwich proves that a society can endure immense trauma and police itself effectively through a shared reality rather than the curated, sterilized illusions that London mandates.
I hear you, but you are romanticizing a society that survives only by the skin of its teeth. Yes, Barnaby quells a riot with a speech, but she is standing in a city where, on any given day, an architectural displacement could drop a 1930s building onto a crowd. Norwich's survival is precarious at best. And you bring up Barnaby's riot over the smuggled magic, which actually acts as a perfect bridge to the core mechanism driving this entire world. Engineered magic versus wild magic.
Right, the crux of the issue.
Exactly. For those who might not immediately grasp the distinction, engineered magic is sterilized, refined, and controlled for industrial use. Wild magic is the unpredictable, radioactive fallout radiating from the Oxford disaster. Cadet Olerin Shaw, despite her naivete in other areas, highlights a fundamental truth about this dynamic. Engineered magic provides the limitless, clean energy that keeps the modern world running. It powers the hospitals, the communications grids, the infrastructure. Unregulated wild magic, as we see in Norfolk, is inherently apocalyptic. It must be refined, controlled, and engineered by trained experts to prevent another Norwich-style map fusion. The practitioners are a necessary evil because their engineered magic sustains global civilization.
That sounds incredibly pragmatic on paper, but have you considered that engineered magic is explicitly the true catalyst for disaster? It is not the solution, it is the accelerant.
How so? The wild magic is what tears the buildings apart.
But what sets the wild magic off? The practitioners claim they are keeping everyone safe, but let's go back to those horrific murders in Norwich. It was smuggled, engineered magic that caused them. Jan Martineau got his hands on concentrated, industrial-grade magic, and it completely addled his brain. It drove him to strangle Naomi Jenkins and carve her up. It drove him to murder Sabrina Wise and throw her in the river. Bringing engineered magic inside Norwich is described as throwing a match into a powder keg. It doesn't stabilize the environment, it incites it.
But that proves my exact point. It is dangerous precisely when it falls out of the hands of the highly trained experts and into the hands of unregulated, untrained citizens like Martineau. That is exactly why London hoards it and regulates it so strictly through the bureaucratic channels we discussed earlier. When an unauthorized user attempts to wield a nuclear reactor's worth of magical energy, people die.
No, it's dangerous even when the so-called experts use it. Look at thaumaturge Olerin Shaw herself. When she is confronted in Norwich, she unleashes her perfectly regulated, engineered magic during her fight with Cade and Barnaby. And what happens? Her expert spells trigger a massive internal city quake. The buildings on Davy Place shimmer and crack. The 1930 City Hall violently reemerges onto the skyline, and 30,000 souls are sent screaming toward the cathedral for sanctuary. The practitioner's engineered magic actively destroys the environment the moment it is applied outside of a sterile laboratory.
Because it was interacting with a contaminated zone.
A contaminated zone that naturally manages itself until practitioners interfere. Now contrast Olerin Shaw's destruction with the environmental resilience of Norwich and its native citizens. The organic resilience of the city is far safer than practitioner domination. The ancient Flint architecture naturally absorbs and stabilizes wild magic. The citizens, born and raised as Norfolk dumplings, have literally developed Flint in the bones. They absorb the ambient chaos. Barnaby taps into the millennia-old power of the chalk and the flint, channeling the history of the landscape to neutralize Olerin Shaw's attack. Norwich doesn't need to dominate magic, it lives in symbiosis with it.
Symbiosis is a very generous term for a population that is perpetually traumatized. The fact that the citizens of Norwich have had to adapt to wild magic developing Flint in the bones, is a testament to human endurance, certainly, but it shouldn't be a model for global governance. You wouldn't look at a population that has developed a resistance to a highly toxic radioactive environment and say, this is how we should all live. You would try to clean up the toxic environment. London's practitioners are attempting to build a world where a child doesn't have to grow up dodging temporal anomalies and bubonic plague on their way to school. Yes, the Flint walls of the Guildhall can absorb magic, but relying on the ancient stone of a single city is not a scalable energy policy for the modern globe. London provides structure, energy, and stability, even if the practitioners at the very top are deeply flawed.
But the practitioners aren't just flawed. Their system is actively predatory. Their stability requires a permanent underclass. We know that they recruit by stealing children from Norwich, children who have natural aptitudes, and putting them through horrific trials. Cade himself was stolen, and his sister was tortured and killed just to keep him in line. London's stability is built on the hidden suffering of the marginalized. They use Norwich as a dumping ground and a secret resource, all while telling the public that Norwichers are diseased monsters. You cannot separate the clean energy of London from the blood it takes to maintain that monopoly. Norwich's model, harsh as it is, forces people to face the consequences of their actions. When you live in a city where reality itself holds you accountable, you build stronger, more honest communities. The strangers, the weavers, the watch, they pull together. They don't hide their mistakes behind classified briefings and memory wipes.
I hear what you are saying about the moral failings of the practitioners. The abduction and abuse of children like Cade and his sister is an indefensible atrocity. I do not defend the corruption of individuals like Persephone, but we must distinguish between the corrupt actors and the necessity of the institution itself. The institution of controlled engineered magic is what keeps the lights on in London. It is what prevents the rest of the world from suffering the map fusion effect. If you dismantle the practitioner hierarchy and let wild magic run rampant, you aren't going to get a quaint, honest community of weavers everywhere. You are going to get the total collapse of modern infrastructure. Airplanes falling out of the sky, just like the fighter jets in Chinex did over Norfolk. Cities vanishing, millions dead. The broad stability provided by London's secretive institutions carries a heavy, terrible cost. But the alternative is global extinction.
I think that is a false dichotomy perpetuated by the practitioners themselves. They want the world to believe that without their iron-fisted, secretive control, the sky will inevitably fall. But the existence of Barnaby herself proves them wrong. She is described by Cade as the world's first wild practitioner. She draws on the natural resonance of the land, the history, the flint, and the chalk. She doesn't need to engineer the magic into something toxic. She channels it organically. If London's establishment were truly interested in saving the world, rather than preserving their own power, they would study Norwich's resilience. They would learn from the map runners. Instead, they arrest them, they banish them, and they try to assassinate them, as they did by framing Cade. London's system is brittle because it relies entirely on suppression. Norwich's system, while scarred, is genuinely resilient because it adapts to reality rather than trying to overwrite it.
Well, it's time we summarize our positions in light of this deep dive into the Oxford Cataclysm's fallout. We've explored two drastically different models of survival in a fractured reality. My position remains that London's secretive, practitioner-led institutions provide a necessary triage. The sheer destructive capability of wild magic, evidenced by the horrific loss of life and temporal collapse in Norfolk, demands strict containment. While the practitioners themselves are deeply fallible and at times demonstrably corrupt, the tiered oversight of engineered magic and the physical quarantine of the exclusion zone are what keep the rest of the globe from descending into apocalyptic chaos. The structured, albeit flawed, procedural guardrails of London's legal system are a necessary burden to maintain civilization.
And my position remains that Norwich proves London's system is ultimately a self-serving monopoly. The brutal honesty and organic community of Norwich offer a far more sustainable model for the future. We've seen how London's systemic secrecy relies on framing innocence, wiping memories, and abandoning the victims of their own magical hubris. In contrast, Norwich has cultivated true environmental resilience, where the citizens and the ancient Flint architecture absorb and stabilize the wild magic naturally. The transparent, if severe, justice administered by Sheriff Hitchman creates a society with deep mutual trust, proving that community accountability is stronger than institutional cover-ups.
We clearly have areas of continued disagreement. The tension between whether the broad stability provided by London's secretive institutions is worth the cost of truth and equality, or whether the brutal honesty of Norwich can truly serve as a scalable model, remains unresolved. However, I think we have reached a vital point of convergence today.
We have. Both of these systems, despite their vast differences, were born out of the profound trauma of the map fusion cataclysm. Whether it is London's desperate overregulation or Norwich's harsh frontier survivalism, both are desperate attempts by humanity to maintain order and find meaning in a reality that has literally been fractured.
Exactly. It highlights the immense value of considering multiple perspectives on governance, crisis management, and the use of power. There is so much more to explore within this material regarding how societies rebuild after the unimaginable happens.
Indeed, it leaves us with complex questions about authority, trauma, and resilience that defy simple answers.
Thank you for joining us for this rigorous